This is just a little supplementary episode about my key primary source so far in the podcast, the Shiji of Sima Qian, known in English as the Records of the Grand Historian. I've talked a bit about Sima Qian in the earlier episodes. He is often introduced to English audiences as the Chinese Herodotus, and while that's a useful description in terms of communicating his importance to the Chinese historical tradition, I think it's also a bit unfair. Much as I love Herodotus's histories, Sima Qian's Records of the Grand Historian is a much grander achievement. It's basically a history of the entire world as Sima knew it, from the earliest time that he had sources for, to his own time. Sima Qian was made Grand Historian in 106 BC, during the reign of Emperor Wu of Han. The job had previously been held by his father, Sima Tan, who had begun work on an ambitious project to record the deeds of rulers and eminent men throughout history. On his deathbed, Sima Tan begged his son to pick up where he had left off and complete the work, and Qian diligently followed his father's instruction. But he had a real personal dedication to the work. And in several spots in the records, he contemplated deeply on the role of the historian. In fact, in 99 BC, Sima got in trouble for offending the emperor and was sentenced to death. The only way to commute this sentence was through bail money or through castration. Being too poor to make the payment, Sima opted to be castrated so that he could live to finish his work. He was able to do so before his death in 86 BC. The resulting product consisted of an enormous 130 chapters containing 500,000 written characters. The Records was not the first historical work in China. However, it was groundbreaking in significant ways. For starters, it was more ambitious in terms of scope than anything before it. The two most important previous historical works, the Book of Documents and the Spring and Autumn Annals, had focused on the speeches of early Zhou and pre-Zhou rulers and on the affairs of the state of Lu respectively. More importantly, Sima's aim with the records was primarily to make an objective record of history. He was scrupulous in his assessment of sources and determined to record events, whatever their moral implications may be. In contrast, the book and the annals were both attributed to Confucius, and even if it was not their actual intention, they were interpreted as being more moral lessons than objective records. Regarding the annals in particular, many believe that Confucius had ignored or distorted the facts to illustrate his teachings. This was not meant to be a criticism of the work or of Confucius, mind you. They thought illustrating the teachings was the aim of the annals, not an insidious subsidiary purpose. Now, of course, the records isn't just a bare record of fact. On the contrary, Sima injects his opinion at the end of most chapters, and he considered his work in some sense to be in the same tradition as the annals. But his methodical, sober approach to using his sources was an accomplishment that was admired by his contemporaries. He worked from written records where he could, and if possible, interviewed people who were connected with the events he discussed. Where he had doubts about the veracity of what he wrote, he made his disclaimers. Now, the form of the records is quite distinctive. Unlike the works of Herodotus, Thucydides, or Livy, the history isn't told as one grand narrative. Rather, it's divided into 5 sections with overlapping narratives. The first section, Basic Annals, is roughly chronological. It contains 12 chapters. The first covers the legendary 5 emperors, then one each for the Xia, Shang, and Zhou dynasties, one telling the history of the state of Qin prior to unification, one for the Qin dynasty, then one for Xiangyu, and finally 5 for the rulers of the Han dynasty up till Sima Qian's own time. There's a bit of time span overlap between the chapters, especially the ones regarding Xiangyu and Liubang, but altogether they give a general chronological account of the major events from the earliest known history to Sima's own time. The next section, Chronological Tables, consists of 10 chapters arranged by period and subject, which basically act as timelines. Because the other sections of the work overlap so much, and because there wasn't one consistent calendar which could be used to date everything from the beginning of time, this section is really useful to use in reference to the other more detailed parts of the work. The next section, Treatises, has 8 essays on historical topics such as rights, religious practice, and economics. They also serve to fill in the details of the reign of Wudi, the emperor who reigned during Sima Qian's lifetime. Wudi's own chapter in the Animals is basically incomplete, and even the text that's there may have been written by a later author. The Hereditary Houses has 30 accounts, similar in style to the basic annals, of eminent families, including the royal families of other warring states. The last section, Biographies, has 70 chapters, each one dealing with a significant man or two, with a class of famous people, such as Confucian scholars or assassins, or with a non-Chinese tribe, such as the Xiongnu or the Yue. The section has some of the more colourful but less reliable storytelling of the records. The format of the records has traditionally been celebrated as a stroke of genius, and I have to say, deservedly so. It would be nearly impossible to tell the history of the known world in a coherent manner if it were told as a single story, without sacrificing a wealth of detail. The format that Sima chose means that he could write a navigable story about the reign of a particular emperor, without having to go into constant tangents about who such and such minister was, or having to describe a barbarian tribe when they invaded, because that information could be found elsewhere in the book. It does mean that you have to be careful when reading it, because if you focus on single chapters in isolation, you won't get all the detail or the context. In my own reading, I found that if you want to understand a particular war, for instance, the Basic Annals chapter will give you a useful outline of the broader strategic situation in the timeline, but if you want more detail about how a particular battle was fought, or about all the intricate sabotaging at work, you should turn to the biographies of generals and statesmen who participated in it. This is a necessary weakness, though, as it would be simply impossible to organise every event described in the records into chronological order and still have the reader be able to follow it. The form was so useful that it became the model for subsequent Chinese historical works, and it would later inspire the scribes of countries that fell into the Chinese cultural sphere, such as Japan, Korea, and Vietnam, to write similar histories of their own nations. The next Chinese historian to follow in the steps of Sima Qian was Ban Gu. Ban Gu lived in the 1st century AD, in the later Han Dynasty. The later Han Dynasty was founded after a brief interruption in the succession of the old emperors by Wang Mang, an event we'll cover at some point down the line. Before Ban Gu began his work, the Hanshu, or Book of Han, other scholars, including his father, Ban Biao, had worked on continuations of Sima's records, picking up where Sima had left off when he died. Ban Gu was still young when his father died, just 22 years old, and again, like Sima, he picked up where his father had left off. He decided that it would be better to write a new book, focusing on the former Han Dynasty, rather than just adding to Sima's work. His work on the book was actually being done privately, and when it was discovered, the Emperor Ming was worried about what the book might say about Han. He had Ban arrested in AD 60. However, when he had a look at the work, he was so impressed that he released Ban and had him do some historical work for the imperial court, and granted him access to the imperial library. In 66, Ban was given permission to continue work on the book. This marks an important distinction between the book and the records. While the latter was an entirely private endeavour, the former was, in the end, a government-sanctioned work. In AD 90, due to court politics, Ban fell out of favour and was arrested. He died in prison that year, 61 years old. The book was not yet complete, and it fell to his sister, the widowed Ban Zhao, to finish the work. One of the most celebrated female scholars in Chinese history, with several works to her own name, she is thought to have written the chronological tables section of the book, as well as one of the treatises. The history was completed in 111. The Book of Han followed the form of the records, although it omitted the section Hereditary Houses. It has 100 chapters, less than the records, but it's actually longer, with around 800,000 written characters. For the reigns where they overlap, the book often copies text verbatim from the records, though it's more precise with its dating of events, and sometimes orders them differently. The focus was limited to just one dynasty, the former Han, and this was an important distinction between the book and the records, which developed into two different models for future Chinese historians to follow. The single dynasty model of Ban Gu was the most imitated, mostly because it gave the historian a manageable subject to deal with. However, it was not without its detractors. From the Chinese philosophical perspective, the most important aspect of history was cyclical change, and by limiting the scope to just one imperial house, instead of covering the transition between different houses, this was an aspect the single dynastic model kind of failed to capture. Thus, some historians made works in the continuous model of the records. Most famously, the Song Dynasty Grand Historian Sima Guang headed a project which covered all of Chinese history from the Warring States period to the Five Dynasties period, the era that immediately preceded his own time. This Zizhi Tongjian, or Comprehensive Mirror in the Aid of Governance, is a mammoth work, 294 volumes long, and containing about 3 million written characters. It departs from the annals biography form of the standard histories, though, instead being arranged chronologically, and is not considered part of that series. Now, I might take the chance to point out the limits of dealing with this subject matter as someone who can only speak English. The Records, despite its fame and importance, is yet to be fully translated into English. Bird and Watson's translation, which was done in the 60s and revised in the 90s, covers most of the important bits, though there are about 40 chapters not included. Other scholars have picked up the slack here and there, and there's an ongoing translation project led by William H. Nienhauser, which should see the whole work in English at some point. The situation regarding the book is worse. The most comprehensive English translation was done by Homer H. Stubbs in the 40s, and includes just 13 chapters, the 12 Annals chapters of the Emperors and the biography of Wang Mang. Some other chapters have been translated in isolation, by scholars doing research on particular topics of interest. As for the standard history that follows the book, dealing with the later Han Dynasty, as far as I'm aware, there are no translations of this in English. Doing the writing for those episodes will be a laugh. So, for the moment, if you want to be able to read these works, you need to learn Chinese or Japanese. Heck, even French would serve you better. If that's not something you want to spend your time on, then just stick with me and I'll try and tell these stories as best I can. Eventually, 24 standard histories were written throughout the course of Imperial China. The last was the history of Ming, completed in 1739 in the Qing dynasty. The poor old Qing never got their own standard history because, there was no imperial grand historian after them to write it. Mind you, both the Republic of China and the People's Republic have made attempts at continuing the tradition, and it'd be fascinating to one day see modern techniques applied in an entry to this series that began more than 2,000 years ago.